Thank you very much for inviting me. I think there's going to be some interesting overlap, actually. So I'm very glad to be here today with you all, exploring these ideas together. So I'll probably take a little bit of a different tack, but I was kind of asked to. So, and I'm going to talk about the region more comprehensively, I suppose. And bring the U.S. a little bit more into it as well in the West Indies. And as we know, a dominant idea in the U.S. is that people are socialized into a two-tier view of race relations, and this is rooted in institutionalized segregation, the one-drop rule, and that this contrasts with the more supposedly fluid common sense about race in Latin America, as well as with the more obvious acceptance of color-class correlations that obtains throughout the West Indies. However, both of the poles of this common sense are not immutably true, as we know. In the US, there has also been a long-standing sensibility and tension regarding the relationships between color and class, and intermediate racial categories like mulatto, quadroon, octoroon were recognized on the census prior to 1920. And in Latin America and the West Indies, racial identification as Black has also been a vector of both socio-political mobilization and everyday understandings of marginalization and inequality. Despite these similarities of experience, however, many still understand models of racial subjectivity and subjectification throughout the Americas in these polar terms. I want to argue here that this is because race in the Americas has been theorized largely in relation to the development of models of societal integration, or the purported lack thereof, and therefore to nation building, whether in the Hispanophone, Francophone, Lusophone, Dutch, or Anglophone Caribbean, or in the United States. This link between nation building and race has produced both the various models of creolization throughout the region, mestiçagem, créolité, métissage, négritude, mestiçagem, afro-latinidade, hispanidade, démocratie raciale, and multiculturalism, and liberal projects of racial vindication, but has marginalized the more radical critique of racialized global geopolitics that emerged from the US and British West Indies during the interwar years, one rooted in a deconstructionist relational, historical, political economy that was partly a response to the intensification of fascism, eugenics, and scientific racism. Ironically, just at the time when Brazilian theorists were elaborating the idea of racial democracy. To a degree, race has been so intimately linked with nation building because the modern history of plantation slavery and racial mixing has created a complicated and contradictory field in which to theorize and exercise personhood and value, and therefore notions of citizenship, creating race as a problem of first disciplinary and then biopolitical management and governance. As a problem, race primarily exists in moments of conflict or in relation to eruptions of violence like race riots, while the foundational violence of New World settlement and exploitation, and thus the origins of Atlantic modernity, are erased. Many scholars across disciplines have shown that the idea of race and the hierarchical institutionalization of racial difference emerged dialectically in relation to 16th century economic transformations that ultimately created what we now know as the modern West. While notions of difference operated prior to this period, the expulsion of Muslims from Europe, the initial European voyages of exploration and discovery, and the development of mercantile capitalism generated a novel situation whereby, for the first time, racialized labor became central to the new plantation-based system of economic production. As Norman Whitten has argued, during the 15th century European settling of the New World, we saw the twin transformative processes of racial fixing of diverse African peoples into negros, and diverse indigenous New World populations into indios, and racial flexibility, the various configurations of creolization, transculturation, and hybridity. And these were processes that became institutionalized through particular extractive labor regimes and constellations of citizenship that excluded non-European groups. At the same time, within European religious, philosophical, scientific, and political discourses, hierarchies of human value were increasingly mapped in terms of gendered, racial, and civilizational difference. In this way, early mercantilism inaugurated material and ideological processes that indelibly linked the New World and Old in a common project of defining modern subjectivity in racial terms. Because these racialized processes also generated the consolidation of both empires and nationalisms within Europe itself, this early moment of globalization engendered a common language not only for an accepted wisdom regarding scales of humanity, but also for related notions of personal freedoms and political revolutions. The initial institutionalization of racialized notions of difference would be subsequently mobilized to serve the late 19th century British project of indirect imperial rule and the new imperialist project of the United States. These were projects that would ultimately also result in the integration of capital markets on at least 5 continents and the subsequent intensification of labor migration, the development of technological innovations, the imagination of both political and social life beyond the territorial boundaries of the nation-state through visions of Ethiopianism, internationalism, and Pan-Africanism, and the elaboration of science, through which we would see the emergence of various strands of social Darwinism that would shape the institutionalization of anthropological notions of racialized civilizational difference. These latter notions would be challenged by late 19th century anti-slavery struggles, as well as mid-20th century anti-colonial and native self-determination struggles, as well as later civil rights and Black Power movements and the universal human rights mobilizations of the mid-century and beyond. Thus, the two moments of European expansion to the New World and the 19th century indirect imperialism generated both the material and ideological frames for understanding late 20th and early 21st century processes in the circum-Atlantic world and beyond. During the 19th and 20th century nationalist movements throughout the Americas, and especially within Latin America, we saw the emergence, as Arcadio was saying earlier, of ideologies that wedded citizenship to particular formulations of mestiçagem, what Stutzman called the all-inclusive ideology of exclusion, which is still one of my favorite phrases, actually. Or a blended subjectivity that nevertheless privileged the contribution of the European part of the triad in the making of the nation. Within the mid-20th century Anglophone Caribbean, and to a degree, though differently formulated, in the United States, decolonization movements led to local concerns regarding the viability of these societies given the past of plantation-based slave production. Debates about the nature of West Indian societies gained critical importance because the then dominant social science view held that social systems needed to be integrated around a common value system in order to thrive without an overarching external system of power and control. The idea that West Indian societies exhibited an incompatible sociocultural pluralism was counterposed with ideas about Creolized stratification, and the Creole model eventually won this argument. Though I think the plural model actually is what we've seen more of since the mid-20th century in the Anglophone Caribbean. In the former, and this is the plural society model, anthropologists considered sectors of the society as institutionally and culturally distinct, unified only as the result of the overarching power exercised by racial and ethnic minorities, while in the latter, they deemed that groups shared values and norms, but were nevertheless divided by class and color differences. In other words, the creolization model is that there's an acceptance of a continuum of cultural practices that tends to correlate to class and color, but the value is on things English, or the value is on it's the blanqueamiento kind of ideal. Such analyses were used to assess the potential success or predict the foreseeable failure of nationalist projects designed to unify diverse sectors of West Indian populations. As in other regions around the globe, these debates became the basis for the mid-20th century development of a cultural politics of race, class, and gender, and tied with the platforms of emerging post-colonial political parties where race and class figured prominently. And of course, in the US during that time, we see both the consolidation of the race relations approach within academic and policy spheres, and this is coming out of the Murdoch study, all of the commissions that were appointed to investigate riots, so 1919 and everyone since then, coming out with this kind of race relations approach, and the development of more radical critiques by activists like Huey Newton, Angela Davis, Assata Shakur, and Malcolm X. Within the West Indies in particular, the concern with nation building, historical consciousness, and racial vindication led to a more general intellectual and political revisionism of the place of Black West Indians in the modern world. Scholars like Kamal Brathwaite and Sylvia Winter, building on Haitian scholar Jean Prisma's reevaluation and affirmation of African-derived folklore in Haiti as the necessary foundation for nationalist development and cultural self-esteem within the context of U.S. occupation, these scholars argued against the notion that a process of acculturation is what characterized Caribbean societies. Their view instead was that the dominant European sector, often absent, did not provide a cultural and social scaffolding to which dominated Africans had to acclimatize, but that Afro-West Indians, in maintaining, reconstructing, and transforming their own cultural practices, and especially those having to do with land use and religious expression, that Afro-West Indians underwent a cultural process of indigenization that rooted them in the New World. For these scholars, it was the African heritage embedded within the folk culture of West Indian slaves that should be seen as the basis for Caribbean cultural creativity and thus developed as a modern national culture. So that's how you get the kind of interesting link between Africanity and indigeneity within populations where indigenous groups that had previously lived there were largely exterminated very early. These scholars were concerned to generate evidence that could both counter the old racist epistemologies and serve the foundations for new, more liberatory claims, which have had the effect across the disciplines of dismantling enduring tropes. Black people are unfit to lead, Black people create dysfunctional families because they're hypersexual, Black people don't have a valuable cultural legacy, etc., etc. While these tropes were common across the Americas, their project ultimately had to do with making a claim for the strength and validity of Caribbean societies as autonomous and legitimately sovereign, seeing the achievement of national independence, therefore, as a form of reparative justice. These mid-20th century vindicationist projects had precursors, of course, in the work of mid and late 19th century scholars and activists like John Jacob Thomas and Antenor Firmin, among others, including those fighting for Cuban independence. However, though these figures would defend Black diasporic perspectives and practices in the face of post-emancipation backlash, they generally remained committed to the colonial institutions of governance they felt ultimately would be capacious enough to expand to include them. There's a tension, however, between both of these vindicationist moments, ultimately nationalist in scope, and the projects that were generated during the interwar years by scholars like Eric Williams, W.B. Du Bois, and C.L.R. James, projects we might better conceptualize as deconstructionist. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, Williams's Capitalism and Slavery, and James's Black Jacobins were designed as antidotes to European notions of legitimacy and governance. Williams especially is concerned to dismantle European claims to superiority and to being the sole inheritors of modernity, and argues persuasively and passionately that the West Indies and the Americas more broadly are nothing if not quintessentially modern. James, as well, in adding Haiti to the modern revolutionary canon, argues that Black West Indians, from the start, lived a life that was, in essence, a modern life. And Du Bois demonstrated how slaves took a role in their own emancipation through work stoppage and ultimately through fighting in the military with the North, despite the fact that the North was not initially anti-slavery. For all three of them, the New World, geopolitical and structural historical frame of analysis, allows them not only to vindicate the humanity of slaves and former slaves, but also to conceptualize race as one of the vectors through which global geopolitical processes, both material and affective, unfolded, rather than seeing race as an intermittent problem to be managed, in part through the elaboration of nationalist frameworks like mestiçagem, and multiculturalism. Of course, one of the tensions between the perspectives of James, Du Bois, and Williams and vindicationist nationalisms is ultimately rooted in a vision of what constitutes the appropriate space for political action. For scholars like James and later Fanon and E. Franklin Frazier, in usurping the struggle for self-determination from the working classes who rose up to challenge colonialism, the nationalist bourgeoisie reasserted colonial paradigms and hierarchies while dressing up nationalism in the clothing of culture. It was, nevertheless, this project that dominated the immediate post-independence period, and with a few extraordinary exceptions, both scholars and activists turned their attention to the space of the nation-state, whether to advance arguments for self-rule or to support civil rights and Black power struggles. This meant that New World scholarship began to primarily serve the purpose of validating the particularities of national histories and cultural practices rooted in specific places. Privileging a national analytic frame continued through the post-independence, post-civil rights context of developmentalism, and as such, race became reconceptualized as culture or cultural difference, and the global historical critique of modernity and humanism was not sustained, creating the limitations that we confront today in terms of both, in terms of discourse, policy, and activism that are related to the questions raised by Arcadio in the beginning. What are the relationships between race, violence, militarism, and notions of citizenship? Thanks.